Okay, so we're on to the second short answer question, or constructed response question. And we have a proof. It's asked us to prove that triangle, that MN is congruent to QP. That's this is congruent to this. And it tells us that angle M is congruent to angle Q, and MO is congruent to QO. Okay? And it's also important to note they named two triangles here. They name OMP, this. I'm going to do this in green. They named this triangle and I'm going to do the other one in red, and this triangle. Okay? So, in these two triangles, we know that M is congruent to angle Q, and we know that, let me do that in a different color. We know that angle M is congruent to angle Q, and we know that MO, this whole side, is congruent to this whole side, QO. Okay. Now we can also easily say that by the reflexive property, angle O is congruent to angle O. So that's going to be, after our givens, that's going to be the first thing we put in our statement and reason. We're doing a two-column proof. We want to say that angle O is congruent to angle O. Okay, and I'm trying to draw a straight line here, and it'll be perfect. Oh, didn't work. Okay, angle O is congruent to angle O, and we know that by the reflexive property. Alright, then we have angle, side, angle, so we can say that these two triangles are congruent. We can say triangle OMP is congruent to triangle OQN. I'm just going to get rid of this and replace it with congruent. Okay. Triangle OMP is congruent to triangle OQN, and I know that by side angle side. Or sorry, angle side angle. Angle side angle. Okay. Now, I can also say that ON, this little side of the red triangle, is congruent to OP, this little side of the green triangle. So I can say ON is congruent to OP. And I know that because congruent parts of corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Once I've said that this triangle is congruent to this triangle, I know that their corresponding parts are congruent. So I'm just going to put CPCTC, that abbreviation we use for corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. And lastly, we have to show that MN is congruent to QP. And we can go ahead and say that MN is congruent to QP. And the reason we know that is the subtraction postulate. If you subtract congruent segments from congruent segments, their differences are congruent. In other words, the subtraction postulate, but let me explain it a bit more. So I'm gonna bring this up again so it's clean. Okay, so we know that this whole side is congruent to this whole side, and we know that this little part is congruent to this part by CPCTC. So if we subtract this big minus this little, we're left with this. If we subtract this big minus this little, we're left with this. And we know that these two are congruent because if you subtract a big thing that's congruent to another, if you subtract two congruent pieces from two congruent wholes, you'll get two congruent parts left over. Okay?